There's a saying among old soldiers that the body forgets pain long before the heart forgets love. And Marcus Idon had lived that saying for 11 years. He was 61 years old, though the joints in his hands did not know it, still strong from decades of gripping a rifle that had not fired a shot in over a decade. B lived alone in a converted grain silo on the edge of a farming settlement called Thistle Hollow, 3 hours from the nearest starport by rail, and further than that, from anyone who remembered what he used to be. The people of Thistle Hollow knew him as the quiet man who fixed fences and mended irrigation lines, who never talked about the scars on his forearms, who kept to himself, except when a child needed help getting a cat down from a silo roof. They called him Old Marcus, sometimes Sergeant, though nobody was quite sure why that title had stuck to him, like a burr. He let them wonder. He preferred it that way. He wore a ring on his left hand, small and unassuming, made of a metal that did not exist naturally on any human world. It was a pale, shifting silver that seemed to hold a faint blue light inside it, like a coal that never quite went cold. Nobody in the settlement asked about it anymore. They had asked once, years ago, and he had only said it was a gift from someone he used to serve. He did not tell them the someone was a queen. He did not tell them that he had once stood at the right hand of a throne on a world 400 light-years away, that he had commanded her royal guard for 6 years, that he had bled for her twice and would have died for her 100 times over without hesitation. He did not tell them that the ring had been placed on his finger by her own hands in a private chamber on the night before he was reassigned back to human space, back to a peace treaty that had needed his testimony more than his sword. He did not tell them because there was nothing left to tell that would not break something in his chest that had only just finished healing. Marcus Idon had been a soldier of the old human expeditionary corps back when humanity was still the newest, strangest, most unpredictable species to sit at any negotiating table in the wider galaxy. He had been assigned, along with 11 others, to the honor guard of a newly ascended alien queen, a young monarch of the virile dominion who had inherited a throne during a succession crisis nobody outside her own system had expected to survive. Her name was Seraphine V. Adalorn, though he had only ever called her by her name twice in 6 years, and both times were moments he still turned over at night, like stones in his palm. The world's perception of Marcus in those days had been simple and dismissive. The other human soldiers considered the Virel assignment a punishment posting, a diplomatic backwater where nothing happened and nobody's career advanced. The Virel court considered the human guards a curiosity at best and a liability at worst. Tall, pale creatures with too much emotion in their faces and not enough patience in their blood. Nobody expected much from Marcus Idon. He was quiet, unremarkable in bearing, the kind of soldier who blended into hallways and stood at attention so still that people forgot he was listening. That was exactly why he had been chosen. He was, in truth, one of the finest close-quarters combatants the Expeditionary Corps had ever fielded, decorated twice for actions, his file described only in redacted paragraphs, and it was his very unremarkableness that made him lethal. He watched everything, he said little, and when the moment came that mattered, he was already 3 steps ahead of the danger, before anyone else in the room had noticed it existed. The moment that mattered came in his 2nd year of service. There had been an assassination attempt on the young queen during a diplomatic banquet, a poisoned dagger meant for her throat, disguised as a ceremonial gift from a rival house. Every other guard in that hall, Virel and human alike, had been looking at the assassin's hands. Marcus had been looking at his eyes and had crossed the room and broken the man's wrist before the blade ever cleared its sheath, twisting the weapon away with a motion so fast that half the court swore afterward they had seen nothing but a blur and heard only the crack of bone. Seraphine V. Adalorn had looked at him then with an expression he would spend years trying to name. It was not fear, and it was not gratitude alone. It was recognition, the way one recognizes a rare thing when it stands revealed in front of them for the first time. After that night, she requested him personally for her private guard rotation, and the quiet human who blended into hallways became the shadow at her shoulder in every room that mattered. The years that followed were not written into any history that Marcus ever read again, though he lived every day of them like scripture. He learned her rhythms, the way she paced when she was buying time to think, the way her second set of eyelids flickered when she was suppressing anger she could not afford to show her court. He learned that she took her tea unsweetened but her private meals absurdly spiced, a small rebellion against the blandness expected of royalty. He learned that she laughed, rarely, but genuinely, a low, surprised sound that she seemed almost embarrassed by, as though laughter were an indulgence a queen should ration. He was not supposed to fall in love with her. Nothing in his training, his contract, or the treaties governing the Expeditionary Corps had prepared him for that particular failure of discipline. And yet, there had been a night, in the 4th year, when a border war on one of her outer worlds had gone badly, and she had come to the guards' quarters after midnight alone, without her retinue, simply because she could not stand another hour in a palace full of advisors who wanted things from her. Marcus had been on watch. He had made her tea the way she actually liked it, not the way court protocol demanded, and she had sat on an overturned crate in a guard station that smelled of gun oil and dust, and cried in front of him without apology, and he had said nothing at all, only stayed, only listened, only let her be a person instead of a crown for 40 minutes in the dark. She never forgot that night, neither did he. Nothing happened between them that would have violated his oath, not in the way courts and gossip might imagine. He never touched her without invitation, never spoke a word out of turn, never let his feelings show in any room where it mattered. But love does not require declarations to exist. It simply exists, quietly, in the space between two people who understand each other completely and choose, again and again, not to reach for what they cannot have. In the 6th year, the treaty came. Human expeditionary forces were being recalled from a dozen border postings as part of a larger diplomatic restructuring, a peace accord that required human testimony back on human worlds to ratify terms that would keep 3 systems from going to war. Marcus's name was on the recall list because his testimony regarding the assassination attempt years earlier was now legally required for a tribunal that could not proceed without him. He did not choose to leave. He was ordered to leave. And a soldier obeys orders, even when obeying them feels like tearing something out of his own ribs. The night before his transport departed, Seraphine summoned him to her private chamber alone, no retinue, no protocol officer standing witness. She had never done that before. It was, in Viral custom, an act that bordered on scandal, a queen alone with a foreign guardsman in her personal quarters at night, and neither of them cared in that moment what it might look like to anyone who found out. She had given him the ring then. It was not, she told him, a Viral royal artifact, not some ancient family heirloom weighted with centuries of meaning. She had commissioned it herself in secret from a jeweler sworn to silence, made from a rare alloy mined only on her homeworld's northern continent, an alloy that virile folklore claimed never dulled, never cracked, never stopped holding its light no matter how many years passed. She told him it was meant to be a thing that lasted. She did not say the words that both of them understood anyway. She did not say that she loved him, because a queen of the Viral dominion could not love a human soldier and remain a queen, not in a political landscape as fragile as the one she had inherited. She did not say that she wished he could stay, because wishing changed nothing, and she had learned young that a monarch's wishes were the least useful currency she possessed. She only slid the ring onto his finger with her own hands, her fingers trembling slightly in a way she would never have allowed anyone else in the galaxy to witness, and said, quietly, that she hoped he would remember her kindly. He had said only one thing in return. He had said her name, just once, without title, without rank, the way a man says the name of someone he is trying to memorize because he knows he will not get to say it again. Seraphine. Then he had left, because that was the order, and because some things end not with a dramatic refusal, but with a quiet man walking onto a transport ship with a ring on his finger and a hollow space behind his sternum that never fully closed again. He had never married. He had tried, once, years later, to build something ordinary with a woman from his own homeworld who deserved better than a man who flinched every time someone mentioned the stars. It had not lasted, and it had not been her fault. He had never blamed her for leaving. He had only ever blamed himself for not being able to explain why. Some nights he sat outside just looking up, turning a ring around his finger, saying a name into the dark that meant nothing to anyone on that entire planet except him. He retired from active service eventually, drifted from post to post, and finally settled in Thistle Hollow. Because it was quiet and far from starports, and nobody there had ever heard the word viral in their lives. He built a life out of fences and irrigation lines and small kindnesses, and if that life was smaller than the one he had once imagined for himself, he told himself it was enough. It had to be enough. Enough was the only thing available to him. That was the world's perception of Marcus Idon, a quiet old man with a strange ring and a past he did not discuss. It was, of course, wildly incomplete. The catalyst, when it finally came, arrived without warning on an afternoon in late autumn, in the shape of a diplomatic convoy that had no business landing anywhere near a farming settlement like Thistle Hollow. It began, as these things often do, with children. A group of virile diplomatic aides, young and inexperienced, had been escorting a low-priority trade delegation through human space when their shuttle suffered a navigation fault and was forced to make an emergency landing 3 kilometers outside the settlement, in the middle of a field that belonged to a farmer named Wren. Dessa's youngest, a boy of 9 named Tobin, had been out chasing a loose goat when the shuttle came down, and in the chaos of the landing, in the shriek of engines venting plasma into stubble that caught fire far too easily, Tobin had frozen in the middle of the field. Quote, trapped between a spreading grass fire and a shuttle hull still hot enough to blister skin. The virile aides aboard the shuttle, panicked and untrained for ground emergencies, did nothing useful in the critical seconds that mattered. One of them, a junior attaché named Corvin Thal, actually made things worse, shouting orders in virile that the terrified boy could not understand, causing him to run the wrong direction, deeper into the smoke instead of away from it. Marcus had been half a kilometer away, mending a fence line, when he heard the boy screaming. He did not think about what he was about to do. He simply moved the way he had moved 11 years earlier. And, before that, for 6 years standing behind a throne. His body remembered before his mind caught up, and by the time his mind caught up, he was already running full speed toward black smoke, with a wet cloth torn from his own shirt pressed against his mouth. He found Tobin in less than 90 seconds, using instincts honed on a dozen worlds far more hostile than a burning wheat field, reading the wind, reading the fire's hunger, cutting a path through the one gap in the flames that a panicked child would never have found on his own. He wrapped the boy in his jacket, shielded his face against his own chest, and carried him out through smoke that had already begun to blister the exposed skin on Marcus's forearms, old scars overwritten with new ones, and did not slow down once. He got Tobin clear. He got him breathing steady, got him drinking water from a canteen with hands that did not shake despite everything, got him laughing weakly within 10 minutes about the story he'd get to tell his friends. The boy would carry no lasting harm from the encounter, beyond a scare that would fade within a season. But the virile delegation had seen the entire rescue, every second of it, captured on shuttle recording. Drones that had been documenting the emergency landing for their own incident report. They had seen a human civilian move with the precision of a combat veteran, navigate a fire zone like a man who had done it 100 times before, and execute a rescue with textbook efficiency that outclassed anything their own trained aides had managed. And, more than that, in the recording, clear as anything in the drone's high-resolution capture, they had seen the ring on his hand as he lifted the boy into his arms. A ring that every virile citizen of a certain rank would recognize immediately, because that particular alloy, that particular pale blue glow, belonged to exactly one jeweler in the history of the Dominion, a jeweler whose royal commissions were a matter of sealed record. The delegation's senior attaché, a nervous, thorough woman named Illyra Kest, pulled the old commission records within the hour, more out of professional curiosity than anything else, and found herself staring at a name she had not expected to see attached to a farming settlement. The ring had been commissioned personally 11 years earlier by Her Radiant Majesty Seraphine Veadalorn, Sovereign Queen of the Virile Dominion. Illyra Kest did not sleep that night. She spent it drafting an emergency dispatch to the royal court, because some things she understood instinctively were far too significant for a junior officer to sit on. The unjust consequence, if it could even be called that, was not born of malice this time, but of a wound in Marcus's life that had simply never been given the chance to heal properly. 11 years of silence had calcified into something he told himself was acceptance. He had built an entire quiet existence around the assumption that the chapter of his life containing Seraphine was closed forever, that the ring was a private grief he alone was allowed to carry, that no force in the galaxy would ever bring the two of them into the same room again. That assumption was about to be shattered, not by tragedy, but by something far more disorienting. The return of hope he had long since stopped allowing himself to feel. 3 weeks after the fire, a formal transport vessel, sleek and unmarked by any commercial insignia, descended onto the very same field where the shuttle had once crash-landed, though this time with considerably more grace. Thistle Hollow had never seen a ship like it, and half the settlement turned out simply to watch it land, farmers and children alike gathering at a respectful distance as the ramp lowered. Marcus was not among the crowd. He was in his silo home, elbow-deep in the guts of a broken water pump, and it was Dessa Wren herself who came pounding on his door, breathless, telling him that a viral royal envoy had arrived and was asking, very specifically, for the man who saved her son. He wiped the grease from his hands slowly. He told himself it could be anything, diplomatic recognition perhaps, or some formal thanks from the delegation whose aides he had embarrassed with his competence. He told himself this while his heart was already hammering with a hope he refused to name, because naming it felt like inviting disappointment to sit down at his table. He walked out to that field with the ring turning slowly around his finger, an old unconscious habit he had never managed to break. The envoy that greeted him was formal, precise, and utterly unprepared for what happened next, because the moment the ship's inner chamber opened and the Queen herself stepped down onto human soil, every rehearsed line of diplomatic protocol dissolved into something far more human than anyone in that delegation had planned for. Seraphine Veadalorn had not sent a representative. She had come herself. She was dressed simply, none of the ceremonial layers of her office, just a traveling cloak, the color of deep water, and her guards hung back at a distance that told Marcus, even before she spoke a word, that this was not a diplomatic visit. This was something else entirely. This was a woman who had ordered her own security to stand down 20 meters back, so that nothing would stand between her and the field where a human soldier waited. She looked exactly as he remembered, and completely different, the way anyone looks after 11 years carry their own quiet weight. There was more gray woven through the dark plumage at her temples. There was a tiredness around her eyes that had not been there before, the tiredness of a monarch who had spent over a decade holding a fragile piece together with her bare hands. But her bearing was the same, that same stillness, that same way of standing as though the ground itself had been informed to hold steady beneath her. She crossed the field toward him, and the entire settlement of Thistle Hollow, and her own bewildered honor guard watched a queen walk faster than protocol technically allowed toward a fence-mending old man in work boots. Marcus did not move. He could not move. 11 years of discipline kept his spine straight and his boots planted, though everything beneath his ribs was in absolute chaos. She stopped in front of him at a distance too close for any formal greeting. And for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, because there was simply too much to say and no order in which any of it made sense to begin. It was Marcus who finally spoke first, because some habits from 6 years of service never fade. He said her name. Just her name without title, the same way he had said it 11 years earlier, on the night she gave him the ring. Seraphine. Her composure, the composure of a woman who had negotiated treaties with hostile warlords and buried political rivals without flinching, cracked entirely at the sound of her own name spoken in that voice, after all that time. She reached for his hand before either of them had decided that she would, taking it in both of hers the way she had once done in a private chamber 11 years earlier. And she turned it over, and she saw the ring. Still there. Still on his finger, exactly where she had placed it, not tucked away in a drawer, as a memory too painful to wear, not sold, not lost, not replaced by any other ring on any other hand belonging to any other woman. 11 years, an entire human decade of ordinary life, of fences and fires and quiet solitude, and he had never once taken it off. That was the moment her composure broke completely. She did not sob loudly, not the way grief is often depicted in stories. It was quieter and somehow more devastating than that, a sudden crumbling of the careful architecture a queen builds around her own heart after years of practice, tears simply falling without permission down a face that had learned long ago never to show weakness in front of witnesses. Her hands tightened around his, not gently, but with the desperate grip of someone confirming that a thing she had convinced herself was only a memory was, in fact, still real, still warm, still standing in front of her after 11 years of silence. Neither of them had chosen. Her honor guard, 20 meters back, did not know where to look. This was not a scene in any protocol manual they had trained on. The internal shift inside Marcus in that moment was not a decision so much as a collapse of every wall he had spent 11 years building. He had told himself, over and over, in 100 quiet nights beneath unfamiliar stars, that the ring was simply a keepsake, a private grief he alone carried, a closed chapter he had made peace with. He realized, now watching her weep openly in front of her own guard, in front of an entire farming settlement, that he had never made peace with anything. He had only learned to survive without it. He did what he had never once been permitted to do in 6 years of service. He raised his free hand and gently wiped a tear from her cheek, an act so small and so far outside any protocol either of them had ever operated under that several of her guards actually took a half step forward before catching themselves. She let him. She spoke, finally, her voice rough with the effort of forcing words through 11 years of restraint. She told him she had watched the recording of the fire a dozen times, not for the rescue, though the rescue had frightened her badly when she realized how close he had come to real harm, but for the moment, the drone caught the ring on his hand as he lifted the boy clear of the smoke. She told him she had spent 11 years telling herself that giving him that ring had been an indulgence she should regret, a queen's foolish sentimentality that served no political purpose and risked everything if discovered. She told him she had rehearsed, more times than she could count, all the reasons she should have taken the ring back that night, instead of giving it to him at all. And then she told him that, seeing it still on his hand after everything, after 11 years of silence and distance and duty pulling them into separate corners of the galaxy, had undone every single one of those rehearsed regrets in the space of a single heartbeat. Marcus told her in turn about the nights he had sat outside his silo, looking up at stars that all looked the same, and none of them looked like home, turning the ring around his finger and saying her name into the dark, like a small, private prayer that nobody else would ever hear. And he told her he had tried once to build a life with someone else and had failed, not because that woman had done anything wrong, but because he had never been able to explain the hollow space in his chest that a ring alone had kept from closing entirely shut. He told her that some things simply do not let go, no matter how much duty or distance is placed between them. The escalation that followed was not one of combat or confrontation, but of a quiet, deliberate unraveling of 11 years of political and personal restraint, played out in full view of two very different worlds that had never expected to witness it. Ilyada Kest, watching from the delegation's position with the rest of the honor guard, understood within minutes that she was witnessing something that would need to be handled with extraordinary care. And to her credit, she was the one who quietly ordered the recording drones grounded, giving her queen the privacy that the moment demanded. Pawson, a small act of loyalty that would later be remembered as the reason the most vulnerable moment of Seraphine's reign was never leaked to a hostile press. The people of Thistle Hollow, for their part, did something that surprised even Marcus. Desireen, whose son owed his life to the quiet man everyone had underestimated for years, stepped forward, first placing a hand briefly on Marcus's shoulder in a gesture of simple human solidarity, and then, without any instruction, the rest of the gathered crowd simply gave the two of them space, forming a loose, respectful perimeter that kept curious onlookers at a distance without anyone needing to ask. It was, in its own small way, an entire community deciding in an instant that whatever this was, whatever history stood revealed in that field, deserved to be honored rather than gawked at. Seraphine's own guards, Initially rigid with confusion about how to process a queen abandoning protocol in the middle of a human farming field, slowly settled into something like understanding as they watched their monarch cling to the hand of a stranger with an intensity none of them had ever witnessed from her before. The loyal lieutenant among them, a senior guard captain named Rain Solveth, who had served Seraphine for nearly as many years as Marcus once had, finally stepped forward and quietly ordered the perimeter widened, giving his queen room to be, for just a few minutes, simply a woman instead of a sovereign. It was Rain who later admitted privately that he had heard stories about the human guardsman from older members of the court, stories about a man who had once broken an assassin's wrist before anyone else in a crowded banquet hall had even registered danger, and he had always assumed those stories were exaggerated the way old stories tend to be. Watching Marcus stand perfectly composed while an entire ruling monarch wept into his shoulder, utterly unbothered by the political weight of the moment, Rain decided the stories had probably been understated, if anything. The antagonist in this particular story was not a person at all, but the slow erosion of 11 years, the quiet tyranny of duty and distance that had kept two people who loved each other in separate corners of the galaxy for over a decade. That erosion had done its damage patiently, methodically, convincing both Marcus and Seraphine that their bond belonged only to memory now, that reunions like this one existed only in stories, that some doors once closed by circumstance simply do not reopen. The final move that duty and distance made, in a sense, was the very fire that nearly took a child's life. It was almost as though the universe itself had grown tired of the quiet injustice it had allowed to stand for 11 years, and had finally almost carelessly thrown a lit match into circumstances that forced two very stubborn hearts back into the same field at last. The point of no return arrived, not in a battle, but in a decision Seraphine made. Standing in that field, tears still drying on her face, guards and farmers alike, watching from a respectful distance, she told Marcus, her voice steadier now, that she had not come merely to thank him for the boy's life, though she was deeply, genuinely grateful for that. She told him she had come because the moment Ilyara's dispatch reached her, the moment she saw the ring in that recording, she understood with sudden, absolute clarity that she was done pretending 11 years of silence had ever been a peace she actually wanted. And she told him that the virile dominion over the past decade had changed considerably. The rigid protocols that once made a relationship between a queen and a foreign guardsman a political impossibility had softened as her reign stabilized and her authority solidified beyond challenge. She was no longer the fragile young monarch clinging to a throne during a succession crisis. She was, after 11 years of hard-won stability, simply the queen, secure enough in her position to make choices that would have been unthinkable in her first year on the throne. She told them plainly, without any of the careful diplomatic phrasing her office usually demanded, that she wanted him to come back with her, not as a guard, not as a subject, as something the old protocols had never even had a word for, because no queen of the Dominion had ever tried to build that particular kind of life before. Marcus's full commitment, when it came, required no hesitation at all. He told her that Thistle Hollow had been a good place to heal, and he would always be grateful for the quiet it had given him, but that he had never once, in 11 years, stopped being the man who had said her name in a private chamber the night before a transport ship carried him away from everything that mattered. He told her that duty had taken him from her side once, under orders he had no power to refuse, and he would not let anything, protocol or distance or 11 wasted years, take him from her side again if she was offering him the chance to stay. The pre-climax standoff, if it could be called that, was brief, almost gentle, by comparison to the story's earlier drama, but no less significant. Rensolveth, ever the careful lieutenant, stepped forward to remind his queen, respectfully, that certain factions within the court would not react well to this, that there would be political consequences, whispered objections, perhaps even outright resistance from noble houses who had long assumed the crown's personal life would remain strictly virile in nature. Seraphine did not hesitate in her answer. She told Rain, in front of the entire gathered crowd, that she had spent 11 years being told what a queen could not have, could not want, could not choose for herself, and that she had given that argument more patience than it had ever deserved. She told him that any noble house prepared to challenge her on this particular matter was welcome to try, and that she looked forward to reminding them exactly how she had survived her own succession crisis in the first place. Ren, to his credit, simply bowed his head and said nothing further. He had, after all, always known better than to bet against his queen once her mind was set. Quote, "The climax of this story was not a battle fought with weapons, but a decision made in full view of two worlds, decisive and utterly unambiguous." Seraphine formally invited Marcus Idon to return with her to the virile dominion, not as a soldier bound by old contracts, but as a free man choosing. This time, without any order compelling him to stand at her side for as long as both of them wished it. Marcus said yes before she had even finished asking. The systematic dismantling that followed was not aimed at any enemy, but at the old assumptions that had governed both their lives for over a decade. Jeet ordered the Queen's field visit spread quickly through diplomatic channels, and within weeks, the story of the human guardsman who had never removed his ring became something closer to legend within certain circles of the Virel court. Noble houses that might once have objected found themselves facing a queen whose popular support, bolstered by a decade of stable, competent rule, made any serious challenge to her personal choices a losing political gamble from the outset. The old rigid protocols that had once made this reunion impossible simply had no teeth left to bite with. The moment of realization belonged in the end to nobody but the two of them, standing quietly in that same field long after the crowd had finally dispersed and given them the privacy they deserved. It was the realization that 11 years of silence had been a wound, both of them carried needlessly, a wound that duty had demanded but that neither the crown nor the corps had ever truly required them to bear for that long. It was the realization that some bonds, forged in a guard station, over shared tea and quiet nights of listening without judgment, do not weaken simply because time and distance are placed between them. They wait. They endure. And sometimes, if the universe allows for one small mercy, they're given the chance to be picked back up exactly where they were set down. The quiet after came slowly, the way real healing always does. Marcus spent one final month in Thistle Hollow, settling his affairs, saying proper goodbyes to a community that had quietly kept his secrets and given him a decade of peace when he needed it most. Desireen cried harder at his departure than she had at the fire that nearly took her son, and Tobin, older now by a season, and considerably wiser about the strange, quiet man who had saved his life, gave Marcus a hand-carved wooden bird as a parting gift, telling him solemnly that it was for luck on his journey to a queen's palace, as though this were the most natural thing in the world for a farming boy to say to his neighbor. Establishing the new status quo took longer, as these things always do, but it took hold nonetheless. Marcus returned to the viral dominion, not as a guardsman bound by contract, but as a companion to its sovereign, a role the court eventually settled into with far less friction than Rain had once predicted. He never took the crown, never sought political power for its own sake, content instead to stand quietly at Seraphine's side the way he always had, watching rooms, reading danger before it arrived. Though these days the greatest danger he guarded her against was simply the loneliness of a throne that demanded everything and gave little back. Seraphine, for her part, governed with a lighter heart than she had known in over a decade, her advisers noting with some private amusement that the queen's famous stillness had softened at the edges, that she laughed more often now, that low, surprised sound she had always rationed like a rare indulgence, no longer quite so rare. The ring never left his hand. It never needed to. But Seraphine, in a small private ceremony witnessed only by Rain and a handful of trusted court elders, gave him a second one to match it, forged from the same alloy, holding the same pale blue light that never dulled, never cracked, never stopped glowing, no matter how many years passed. She told him, placing it on his hand herself, that this one was not a parting gift. This one, she said, was a beginning. The final thematic truth of this story, the one that mattered above every treaty and protocol and political maneuvering that surrounded it, was simple enough that a child could have understood it. Some love does not need declarations to survive 11 years of silence. It only needs one person, somewhere in the galaxy, stubborn enough to keep wearing the ring, and one person brave enough, when the chance finally comes, to cross a field and ask if it still fits. It did. It always had. If this story moved you, if you found yourself holding your breath in that field alongside them, let me know in the comments what you thought of their reunion and which moment hit you hardest. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it, share it with someone who loves a story about love that outlasts duty and distance, and subscribe if you want more tales like this one, stories of quiet strength, hidden depths, and the kind of devotion that no amount of time can erode. Ring the notification bell so you never miss the next one. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep the ring on your finger and keep your eyes on the stars.